Some people build empires to rule the world. Others spend their entire lives searching for one person who makes them want to come home. The first thing I noticed wasn't the mansion. It wasn't the marble staircase that curved beneath a crystal chandelier the size of my entire apartment. It wasn't the fleet of black luxury SUVs parked in perfect formation outside, or the men in tailored suits standing so still they looked like statues. It was the silence. The kind of silence that felt carefully protected, as if laughter had been forbidden years ago and no one had dared to break the rules since. I tightened my grip on the small canvas duffel bag hanging from my shoulder and reminded myself that I desperately needed this job. 24 years old, 2 overdue rent notices folded inside my wallet, and exactly $63 left in my checking account didn't leave much room for pride. Housekeeping at the Moretti estate paid almost twice what I had earned cleaning hotel rooms in Brooklyn, and the agency had repeated the warning 3 separate times before sending me here. Never speak unless spoken to. Never ask personal questions. Never look directly at Mr. Damian Moretti unless necessary. I nodded through every instruction, promising myself I would be invisible. Invisible people kept their jobs. A silver-haired butler opened the enormous front door before I could knock. His expression never changed as he studied me from head to toe. "Emily Carter?" he asked. I swallowed. "Yes, sir. Follow me." My sneakers barely made a sound against polished marble floors. Every painting looked older than my grandparents'. Every vase probably cost more than a year's rent. Fresh white lilies filled the air with a clean fragrance that somehow made the mansion feel even lonelier. Several housekeepers passed us without speaking. They lowered their eyes the moment they noticed the butler, as though even casual conversation belonged somewhere outside these walls. "Mr. Moretti returns from a business meeting in 5 minutes," the butler said without slowing down. "Stand beside the entrance with the staff. Say nothing." My heartbeat climbed higher with every step. I had never met anyone remotely famous, let alone a man newspapers described as one of New York's most influential businessmen. Stories followed his name everywhere. Brilliant, ruthless, untouchable. A man who ignored every charity gala, every social invitation, every woman introduced to him by powerful families. Nobody seemed to know where the truth ended and the rumors began. I joined the line of employees near the grand entrance, trying to make myself as small as possible. Then the front doors opened. Cool autumn air drifted inside before he did. Tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit. Dark hair brushed neatly back. Calm gray-blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. The entire room seemed to breathe differently as Damian Moretti crossed the threshold. The butler gave the slightest nod. Every employee bowed their heads. My palms became slippery. "Don't speak, Emily. Don't move. Don't embarrass yourself." But nerves have a strange way of stealing control. I looked up for half a second, met those impossibly steady eyes, and before my brain could stop my mouth, the words escaped in the softest whisper. "Welcome home, husband." The silence that followed was louder than thunder. Nobody spoke. Not the butler. Not the housekeepers. Not even the grandfather clock across the foyer seemed brave enough to announce another second. I stood frozen, my face burning so intensely I wished the polished marble floor would simply open beneath my feet. My grandmother used to tell me that nervous people often said the first comforting words that came to mind. Every evening when my grandfather returned from work, she would smile, straighten her apron, and whisper, "Welcome home, husband." I had heard those words thousands of times growing up. Somehow, standing inside the quietest mansion I had ever seen, my frightened mind reached backward instead of forward. I opened my mouth to apologize, but no sound came out. Damian Moretti studied me with an expression so calm that it became impossible to guess what he was thinking. His gray-blue eyes did not carry anger. They carried curiosity, and somehow that felt even more terrifying. Finally, he shifted his attention toward the silver-haired butler. "Who hired her?" His voice was low and measured, forcing everyone else to lean in rather than him raising it. "The employment agency, sir," the butler answered immediately. "She arrived this morning." Damian looked back at me. I lowered my eyes so quickly that I almost lost my balance. "What is your name?" he asked. "Emily Carter, sir." "How long have you been working here?" "About 20 minutes. Someone behind me quietly inhaled, probably expecting me to be escorted out before my first paycheck. Instead, Damien slipped off his tailored coat and handed it to the butler without taking his eyes off me. 20 minutes, he repeated, almost as though he found the number interesting. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he walked past me without another word. His footsteps faded toward the east wing, leaving behind a silence that somehow felt completely different from the one before he arrived. It was no longer cold. It was uncertain. The moment he disappeared around the corner, every employee seemed to breathe again. One of the maids lightly grabbed my wrist. "You are still here," she whispered, sounding genuinely shocked. "I thought I was fired," I admitted. The butler adjusted Damien's coat over one arm before turning toward me. His face remained perfectly composed, but his eyes softened just enough for me to notice. "Mr. Moretti did not dismiss you. Does that mean?" "It means you begin work immediately." I blinked twice, unsure whether I had heard correctly. Another housekeeper handed me a folded cleaning apron. "The library needs dusting," she said, still staring as though I had somehow survived impossible odds. As I followed her through endless hallways filled with sunlight spilling across polished wood floors, I noticed something unusual. Every employee kept glancing toward me before quietly looking away. They were not judging me. They were trying to solve a mystery. By late afternoon, I had already managed to knock over a stack of neatly folded towels, apologize to 3 different people, and nearly walk into the wrong hallway before being redirected by the cook with a patient smile. I felt hopelessly out of place. Yet every time I expected someone to tell me to leave, they simply reminded me where to go next. Just before sunset, I passed a large portrait hanging above the grand staircase. A beautiful woman stood beside a younger version of Damien, both smiling in a way I could not imagine seeing now. Fresh white lilies rested beneath the painting. Without realizing it, I quietly smiled at the portrait and whispered the same words my grandmother had repeated every evening of her married life. "Welcome home." I never noticed the gray-blue eyes watching me from the second-floor balcony above. The next morning I woke before sunrise in the small staff room tucked behind the west wing, convinced the previous day had been a dream that would end the moment someone handed me a dismissal letter. Instead, the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the hallway. Birds sang beyond the tall windows overlooking acres of perfectly trimmed gardens, and my name was neatly written beside the day's housekeeping schedule. I stared at it for several seconds before quietly thanking God under my breath. Maybe I really had survived my first day. Maybe miracles wore ordinary clothes after all. My confidence lasted exactly 12 minutes. While polishing a silver serving tray, I accidentally spun it sideways, sending a single polished apple rolling across the breakfast room like it had suddenly developed a mind of its own. The apple bounced once against a chair leg before stopping beside an expensive pair of black leather shoes. My stomach dropped. Slowly, painfully slowly, I looked up. Damien Moretti stood there holding a cup of black coffee, already dressed for another day, looking as calm as if the entire world moved according to a schedule only he understood. I rushed forward so quickly that I nearly slipped on the polished floor. "I am so sorry, sir." I bent down to retrieve the apple, only to bump my forehead lightly against the edge of the table. A quiet laugh escaped one of the younger kitchen assistants before he instantly covered his mouth, realizing where he was. I expected the room to freeze. I expected the assistant to lose his position for laughing in front of the man everyone feared. Instead, Damien picked up the apple himself, placed it gently back onto the tray, and said only 3 words. "Walk more slowly." That was all. No lecture. No disappointment. Just simple advice delivered in the same calm voice. He continued toward the dining room as though nothing unusual had happened. Every employee watched him leave before turning toward me with identical expressions of disbelief. "He has never done that," the cook whispered. "Done what?" I asked. "Given advice instead of silence." The rest of the morning passed with fewer disasters, although I still managed to fold towels unevenly and nearly water an artificial plant before another maid quietly redirected me. Nobody mocked me. In fact, they seemed strangely patient, as if my clumsy mistakes had become something everyone secretly expected. Around noon, I carried fresh flowers into the East Library, the quietest room in the mansion. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves surrounded enormous windows where autumn sunlight spilled across polished hardwood floors. Dust floated through the golden light like tiny stars. I carefully replaced yesterday's lilies with fresh ones and noticed a framed family photograph resting beside the fireplace. The woman from the staircase portrait smiled warmly while a teenage Damien stood beside her, looking years younger and surprisingly relaxed. There was something gentle in his expression that no longer existed. I found myself smiling back at the photograph. "She looks kind," I whispered without thinking. She was. The voice behind me startled me so badly that I almost dropped the vase. Damien stood quietly in the doorway, one hand resting inside his coat pocket. I turned so quickly that water splashed onto the wooden floor. "I am sorry. I did not know anyone was here." He ignored the spilled water completely and looked instead at the photograph. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked a question so unexpected that I almost forgot to answer. "Why do you smile every time you see my mother's picture?" For a moment, I forgot to breathe. My fingers still held the damp cloth I had planned to use on the bookshelf, but they refused to move. Damien remained near the doorway, waiting with the same impossible patience that made every silence around him feel meaningful instead of awkward. I glanced back at the photograph before answering. "Because she looks like someone who made people feel safe." The words escaped before I could polish them into something more careful. His expression did not change, yet something subtle flickered behind those gray-blue eyes. "Most people notice the mansion first," he said quietly. "You noticed her." I looked down, embarrassed. "My grandmother always said you can tell what kind of home a family has by the way people smile in old photographs." The corners of his mouth almost moved, not enough to become a smile, but enough for me to wonder if I had imagined it. "And what does this photograph tell you?" he asked. I hesitated, afraid of saying the wrong thing again. That someone was loved very much. The library became perfectly still. Even the ticking clock above the fireplace seemed farther away. Damien lowered his eyes toward the frame resting on the mantel. "She believed every house could become a home," he murmured, almost to himself. Before I could answer, another employee appeared outside the doorway carrying a folder. The moment he noticed me standing there with Damien, he stopped walking. "Sir, your meeting begins in 15 minutes. Damien nodded without looking away from the photograph. "I know." He turned toward the hallway, then paused after only 2 steps. "Emily." Hearing my name from him felt strangely unfamiliar. "Yes, sir." "The lilies suit this room better than the roses." "Thank you, sir." He left as quietly as he had arrived. I stood there staring after him until his footsteps disappeared. Later that afternoon, the kitchen buzzed with whispers that immediately stopped when I entered. The cook pretended to organize spice jars while the younger assistant struggled not to grin. Finally, the head housekeeper sighed. "What exactly did you say to him this time?" I blinked in confusion. "Nothing important." She folded another clean towel with perfect precision. "Mr. Moretti has never commented on flowers before." I laughed softly. Maybe he was simply being polite. For pairs of eyes looked at me as though I had suggested winter snow was warm. "Polite?" the assistant repeated. "Mr. Moretti thanks people by approving budgets, not by discussing lilies." I could not help smiling. Well, everyone has to start somewhere. The room fell quiet again before the cook unexpectedly chuckled. It was a small sound, but genuine. Soon another maid smiled. Then someone else. For the first time since arriving, the kitchen no longer felt like a workplace wrapped in silence. It felt alive. As evening settled over the estate, golden sunlight faded behind tall oak trees and soft lamps filled the hallways with warm light. I carried a tray of freshly baked dinner rolls toward the dining room, breathing in the comforting smell of butter and rosemary. Passing the entrance hall, I noticed Damien standing alone beside the front windows, his jacket draped over one arm as he looked out at the long driveway, disappearing into the twilight. Without thinking, I slowed my pace and spoke in the same gentle voice I had heard my grandmother use countless evenings before. "Dinner is ready whenever you are, sir. It tastes better while it is warm." He remained facing the window for several seconds. Then, without turning around, he answered with a calmness that somehow reached deeper than any raised voice ever could. "Nobody has said that to me in a very long time." His words stayed with me long after the dining room lights faded and the mansion settled into another quiet night. Nobody has said that to me in a very long time. They sounded less like a conversation and more like a memory that had accidentally escaped. I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my small room, wondering how someone surrounded by so many people could still sound so alone. The next morning arrived wrapped in soft golden sunlight pouring through the tall kitchen windows. The entire estate seemed to wake with practiced precision. Coffee brewed exactly at 6. Fresh bread came out of the oven at 6:15. Gardeners crossed the eastern lawn before 7. Everything followed a schedule except the people. They moved efficiently, but never casually, as though everyone had forgotten what it felt like to simply enjoy an ordinary morning. While arranging fresh fruit in the breakfast room, I noticed Margaret, the oldest housekeeper, replacing yesterday's lilies with another bouquet of white blooms. She had worked at the estate for more than 30 years, and everyone quietly respected her. I smiled as I helped trim the stems. "Mr. Moretti seems to like lilies," I said. Margaret paused for a moment before carefully setting one flower into the crystal vase. "His mother loved them," she answered. She believed flowers reminded people that beautiful things only stay beautiful when someone cares for them every day. I gently touched one of the white petals. "She sounds wonderful." Margaret smiled, but there was sadness behind it. She greeted every person who walked through those front doors the same way, whether it was family, staff, or delivery drivers. I looked at her with growing curiosity. "How?" Margaret met my eyes. She always said, "Welcome home." My hands became perfectly still. The room around me disappeared. Suddenly, my grandmother's tiny kitchen returned so clearly that I could almost smell fresh apple pie cooling on the windowsill. Every evening, she wiped her hands on her apron, walked to the front door before my grandfather even reached the porch, and welcomed him home with the same warm smile. She used to tell me that houses were built with wood and stone, but homes were built with words people never grew tired of hearing. I quietly laughed to myself. My grandmother believed the exact same thing. Margaret looked at me with gentle surprise. Perhaps kindness sounds the same no matter where it is learned. Later that afternoon, I carried clean linens toward the upstairs hallway when I noticed the silver-haired butler carefully polishing an antique picture frame outside Damien's private study. Inside the frame was another photograph of his mother standing near the front entrance of the mansion, smiling toward someone just outside the camera's view. The butler caught me looking. "Mrs. Moretti never allowed anyone to enter this house without feeling welcome," he said softly. "Even on her busiest days, she always walked to the front door herself." I felt my chest tighten. Did Mr. Moretti inherit that from her? The butler's polishing cloth slowed. He inherited everything except her peace. Before I could ask another question, the study door quietly opened. Damien stepped into the hallway, already dressed for another afternoon of meetings. His eyes moved from the old photograph to me, then rested briefly on the bouquet of fresh lilies waiting beside the staircase. For the first time since I had arrived, I realized he was not looking at the flowers. He was remembering the woman who used to place them there. And somehow, without meaning to, I had begun walking through memories that no one else in the mansion dared to touch. The mansion felt different after that afternoon. Nothing visible had changed. The marble floors still reflected the morning light. The clock still chimed exactly on the hour. The staff still moved with quiet discipline through endless hallways. Yet beneath the familiar routine, something almost invisible had begun to shift. People smiled a little more often. Conversations lingered a few seconds longer. Even the silence no longer felt heavy. It simply felt peaceful. I could not explain why. Maybe homes changed one ordinary moment at a time. A few days later, rain clouds rolled across the New York sky, covering the estate in soft gray light. I volunteered to help unload groceries from the delivery truck before the weather became worse. The gardeners hurried to cover delicate flower beds while the kitchen staff carried crates of fresh produce inside. As I reached for the final wooden box, I noticed an unfamiliar sedan slowing near the front gate. It did not belong to the regular delivery schedule. The driver remained inside much longer than expected, watching the entrance without moving. Something about it felt wrong. Not frightening, just out of place. I quietly mentioned it to one of the security guards standing beneath the stone archway. He thanked me with a polite nod and spoke into a small radio. Within moments, another guard approached the vehicle and greeted the driver. After a brief conversation, the sedan turned around and drove away without ever entering the property. Everything happened so calmly that none of the kitchen staff even noticed. I returned to carrying grocery bags, assuming it had been nothing more than someone lost in the neighborhood. Later that afternoon, the silver-haired butler found me arranging fresh towels in the guest wing. Mr. Moretti would like to thank you, he said. I looked up in surprise. For what? The vehicle you noticed was not expected. Your attention allowed our team to verify the situation before anyone entered the grounds. I felt embarrassed. I only thought it looked unusual. Most people would have ignored it. Before I could answer, Damien appeared at the end of the hallway, having just returned from another meeting downtown. He stopped a few feet away, his calm eyes meeting mine. You pay attention, he said. My grandmother always told me to notice small things. I replied with a nervous smile. Sometimes people only need someone to notice them. He remained quiet for a moment, as though turning those words over in his mind. Then he glanced toward the rain-covered gardens outside the tall windows. Small things are often the ones that matter. It was the longest conversation we had shared, yet it felt effortless. As he continued down the hallway, I realized he no longer looked through people the way he had during my first day. He actually looked at them. That evening the cook prepared homemade chicken soup because the weather had turned cold. Without thinking, I filled an extra bowl and placed it near the warming tray outside Damien's study with a handwritten note that simply read, "Please eat before it gets cold." I assumed one of the staff would remove it before he ever saw it. The next morning the empty bowl had been washed, the note carefully folded instead of thrown away, and beside it rested a single fresh white lily, placed there so gently that not one petal had bent. No name, no explanation, just one quiet answer that somehow said more than words ever could. The white lily remained on the warming tray for the rest of the day because I could not bring myself to move it. Every time I walked past the study, I caught myself smiling before remembering where I was. The strange thing was not that Damien had accepted a bowl of soup. It was that he had answered kindness with kindness, quietly, without asking for recognition. That single flower became the estate's newest mystery. Nobody admitted placing it there, yet everyone seemed to notice it. Margaret smiled the moment she saw it, but said nothing. The silver-haired butler simply adjusted it into a crystal vase before continuing with his morning routine. By the end of the week, something even more surprising began happening. The mansion sounded different. The kitchen staff no longer whispered through breakfast preparation. Someone softly hummed while kneading fresh bread. One of the gardeners laughed after another accidentally sprayed himself with the garden hose. Instead of disappearing, the instant footsteps echoed through the hallway. Conversations simply became quieter before continuing. It was as though everyone had remembered they were human again. I noticed the biggest change during Friday breakfast. Damien entered the dining room precisely at 7:30, as always. The newspapers waited beside his coffee. Fresh fruit rested neatly on a silver platter. Usually, every employee stepped aside the moment he appeared. That morning, however, the youngest kitchen assistant became flustered while carrying a basket of warm rolls. He stumbled slightly, and one roll landed on the polished floor. The room froze. The young man immediately bent down, apologizing over and over. I held my breath, expecting another painful silence. Instead, Damien calmly picked up the fallen roll, placed it on a separate plate, and looked toward the nervous assistant. "Take a fresh one," he said. "Nobody works well while they are afraid." The words settled over the room more gently than sunlight through the dining room windows. The assistant blinked twice before whispering, "Thank you, sir." After Damien left for his morning meetings, the cook leaned against the kitchen counter and quietly shook his head. "I have worked here for 18 years, he murmured. I have never heard him say something like that. Margaret glanced toward me with a knowing smile that made me instantly shake my head. "It was not me." "Perhaps not," she replied. "But kindness has a way of inviting more kindness." The days continued unfolding with simple routines that somehow felt extraordinary. Damien occasionally paused to compliment the fresh flowers. He thanked the gardeners for preparing the grounds before an important charity luncheon. He even asked the chef to send extra meals to a neighborhood shelter after learning the weather forecast predicted an unusually cold weekend. Nobody announced these changes. There were no speeches, no dramatic moments. They simply appeared, one quiet decision after another, like sunlight slowly filling a room at dawn. One evening, while replacing books in the library, I overheard two senior executives leaving Damien's office after a meeting. "You seem different lately," one of them said with a friendly laugh. "Less distant," Damien answered after a thoughtful pause. "I spent years making this place efficient." His voice remained calm, but there was warmth inside it that had not been there before. I forgot it was supposed to feel like home. I stood perfectly still behind the bookshelf, my heart suddenly beating faster. He had not been talking about the mansion alone. Somehow, without either of us planning it, two lonely lives had begun changing the atmosphere of an entire house, and neither of us fully understood where that quiet transformation would lead next. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the maple trees surrounding the estate in shades of amber and crimson. Every morning the front lawn shimmered beneath a blanket of fallen leaves, and every evening the house seemed warmer than the one I had entered only weeks before. It was no longer the marble walls or the towering windows that caught my attention. It was the people inside them. They greeted one another more often. The gardeners shared fresh apples during their afternoon break. The kitchen staff lingered over coffee for an extra minute before returning to work. Even the silver-haired butler had started wishing everyone a pleasant evening before retiring to his quarters. The mansion had not become louder. It had simply become kinder. One quiet Saturday afternoon, while organizing books in the library, I heard soft footsteps. Behind me, I turned to find Damien standing near the fireplace with his hands resting comfortably inside his coat pockets. He was not carrying a briefcase. There were no assistants waiting outside the door. For the first time since I had arrived, he looked like a man with nowhere urgent to be. He glanced toward the old family photograph before looking at me. "Emily." "Yes, sir." He remained silent for several seconds, almost as though he had rehearsed the question many times but had never found the right moment to ask it. Finally he spoke. "Why did you call me husband on your first day?" Heat rushed into my face so quickly that I nearly laughed from embarrassment. I lowered my eyes toward the wooden floor. "I have wanted to apologize for that every single day." "You never answered the question." I smiled nervously, because I was terrified. That unexpected answer earned the smallest hint of amusement in his expression. I took a slow breath before continuing. "When I become nervous, I remember home instead of thinking clearly." My grandmother greeted my grandfather every evening with those exact words. She believed love lived inside ordinary routines. She used to tell me that no matter how difficult life became outside the front door, someone should always make coming home feel peaceful. I looked toward the photograph of his mother. When I saw this house, I did not see the marble or the expensive furniture. I only saw a place that felt like it had forgotten how to welcome anyone. My mind reached for the happiest memory it knew before I could stop it. Damien remained perfectly still. His gray-blue eyes drifted toward his mother's portrait, where sunlight rested gently across the smiling face frozen in time. After a long silence, he quietly nodded. My mother said something very similar. I looked back at him. Really, she believed a house became a home the moment someone waited for you without asking for anything in return. His voice softened until it almost blended with the quiet crackling of the fireplace. After she passed away, nobody ever waited. The words settled heavily between us, carrying years of loneliness without bitterness. I felt my eyes sting, but I smiled anyway. Someone always should. For the first time since I had met him, Damien smiled without hesitation. It was not a large smile. It was not dramatic. It was simply real. In that single moment, he looked less like the powerful businessman the world admired from a distance, and more like the young man smiling beside his mother in the old photograph. As golden afternoon light filled the library, I realized neither of us had changed each other's lives with grand gestures. We had simply reminded one another of something both of us had almost forgotten. Home was never a place. It was a person who made you feel expected. Nearly a year passed before I realized that the grand mansion no longer echoed when I walked through its halls. The silence that had once felt heavy had been replaced by quiet conversations, warm laughter drifting from the kitchen, and the comforting aroma of fresh bread rising every Sunday morning. Seasons had changed outside the tall windows, but something even greater had changed inside the people who called the estate home. The gardeners planted white lilies beside the front entrance because Margaret said they reminded everyone that hope should always bloom where people returned each day. The young kitchen assistant who had once trembled whenever Damien entered the room now greeted him confidently every morning. Even the silver-haired butler occasionally allowed himself the smallest smile whenever he thought no one was watching. I often wondered if homes healed people as quietly as people healed homes. One crisp autumn evening, Damien returned from a week of business meetings across the country. The long driveway glowed beneath golden leaves as the familiar black sedan rolled slowly toward the front entrance. Nobody had instructed the staff to gather. There was no formal welcome waiting on the front steps. Everyone simply continued with their evening routines because the mansion no longer depended on ceremony to feel alive. I happened to be arranging fresh lilies beside the doorway when I noticed the headlights approaching through the glass. Without thinking, I placed the final flower into the vase, brushed invisible dust from my apron, and opened the front door before the car came to a complete stop. Cool evening air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. Damien stepped out, carrying only a small leather travel bag instead of the stack of documents that usually accompanied him. For a brief moment, we simply looked at one another. There were no awkward silences anymore. No uncertainty. Just the peaceful familiarity that grows between people who have quietly changed each other's lives. A gentle smile found its way across my face before I even realized it. "Welcome home," I said softly. This time I did not stumble over the words. I did not blush from embarrassment. I simply meant every syllable. Damien stood perfectly still, looking past the marble columns, beyond the polished floors, and into the warm light spilling from the open doorway. His eyes wandered across the fresh lilies, the comfortable glow of the entrance hall, and finally back to me. Then he smiled with the same quiet sincerity I had first seen months earlier in the library. "I am home," he answered. "Not I am home now. Not I made it back. Simply, I am home." At that moment, I understood he was not speaking about the building behind me. We walked inside together as the front door closed gently against the cool evening breeze. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone laughed. A kettle began to whistle. Margaret reminded the cook not to overbake the dinner rolls. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary people. Ordinary moments. Yet together they formed something money could never purchase and power could never command. I once believed I had come to that mansion searching for a paycheck. Instead, I found proof that the strongest hearts are not changed by fear, admiration, or wealth. They are changed by simple kindness repeated often enough to become part of everyday life. Looking back now, I still smile whenever I remember the frightened young woman who accidentally spoke the wrong words on her first day. Perhaps they were never the wrong words after all, because sometimes destiny does not arrive with perfect timing or careful planning. Sometimes it quietly borrows the language of home, waits by an open door, and reminds even the loneliest soul that every journey is really just the search for someone who is genuinely happy to see you come back.